All right, let's get going. We're going to finish up chapter 3 today. And again, you have your first exam opens on Sunday at noon, and I've extended it to close at midnight on Monday. So 11:59 on Monday. So you've got a little more time to get it done. Same, but you only have 90 minutes once you open it, right? So wherever in that 36-hour window you open it, it closes after 90 minutes, regardless of whether you open it on Sunday or you open it on Monday. It closes after 90 minutes. So don't open it at 11 o'clock on Monday night. It's going to close at 11:59. Okay. All right. So we were talking about pre-industrial medicine and the underlying belief system in pre-industrial medicine. And so I talked about the theory of the humors that came from Hippocrates back in 500 AD-ish, 450. I mean, who's counting at that point, right? But that was state-of-the-art medicine. So if you were, to go to the University of Liechtenstein, back in 1802 to study medicine and be a highly educated physician, you would have learned that when someone has a fever, you cut them and bleed them. When someone has a headache, you give them an enema. When somebody, is feeling dizzy, you make them throw up and so forth. And this was cutting edge medicine. So in other words, medicine just didn't work very well. It doesn't matter if you had a doctorate, PhD after your name or not. You didn't, the stuff you did to your patients probably hurt them as much as helped them. Another belief that they had was this idea of spontaneous generation, which I think comes from Aristotle, but probably he was just writing about it. And it was a thing that human beings believed. And that belief was that inert material became spontaneously turned into life, right? So the example I used at the end of the class here was this piece of meat, right? An inert dead piece of meat. Just spontaneously would sprout maggots. They didn't understand that the flies were landing on the meat and laying eggs, which then became maggots, which then ate the meat, right? They just thought cutting edge science in a classroom in Liechtenstein in 1802 would have told you spontaneous generation. It's what happens when we put, inert materials on the ground. They spontaneously grow life. So that's the operating underlying assumptions. So compare that to, healthcare delivery in the United States with people. You could basically just hang out a shingle and declare yourself a doctor. I'm not sure that those folks were any worse at being doctors than the people being trained on this fine, ancient Greek philosophy. The people who actually could do stuff for you were, the surgeons who were barbers, like we talked about, right? So, and that was very crude medicine. A really good surgeon could cut your leg off in under a minute. And by God, if I was going to have my leg cut off without anesthesia, I want somebody to do it really, really fast. And I won't really care so much about the scarring, right? So we have to bear in mind what the state of technology was at the time before we start getting all crazy and criticizing, medicine in the United States. People were hanging out their shingle and selling, snake oil, right, as a cure-all, which people did all kinds of stuff. Coca-Cola was originally sold as some sort of a healing elixir back in the day when it actually had cocaine in it. And yeah, it'll make you feel better because cocaine does that. But it, is it a cure-all for everything that ails you? No. Good time. So what else we've got going on? So we've been talking about the emergence of providers, so physicians and other related entities, pre-industrial. What about the big, what I refer to as the 800-pound gorillas of healthcare delivery? Hospitals. Well, hospitals, as we know them, did not exist in pre-industrial times. First of all, if you had any money and any family, you were cared for in your home. only the destitute went to hospitals. And hospitals in North America really didn't exist. What we had instead were some more primitive kind of institutions. Almshouses were kind of general purpose shelter and care for indigent. So, if you didn't have any family, if you didn't have anybody that cared about you enough to allow you to live in their house, you would be relegated to an almshouse. Pest houses. Pest houses were actually tended to be run by the government. So almshouses were typically nonprofit charitable functions. So your church, your local church, would also perhaps run an almshouse, or the wealthy people of your community might sponsor an almshouse. Not that they would live there, but they would sponsor it, right? Pest houses, however, were often run by the government, right? Primitive state governments, primitive governments would run pest houses, and a pest house is isolation for contagious disease. So the really killer contagious diseases of the day included things like smallpox, right? Jeffrey Amherst of Amherst College fame down there in Western Mass, very famously intentionally gave out blankets infested with smallpox to the local Indian tribes to help wipe them out. So that's, smallpox mostly eradicated today, thanks to inoculation and vaccines, right? Was a real problem back in the day. It killed a lot of young people in particular, and it was pretty rampant. So pest house, if you got a disease, you'd be sent to a pest house. You might be taken there involuntarily, right? So patrols would come around and look to see, all right, we heard there was an outbreak of smallpox. Let us into your house. Let me look around. Oh, your kid has smallpox. We're going to take your kid and stick them in the pest house. If they survive, we'll send them back home. Asylums. So the mentally ill have always been with us. Asylums were, a place where the mentally ill were sent and largely ignored. Asylums were awful places because, in part, we didn't know how to treat mental illness, and we still have. And mental illness is still one of the areas of real mystery. We have some medications that were developed in the 50s that can actually treat some conditions to some degree, depression, anxiety, and psychosis. We have some medications that do some good with that, but they have terrible side effects, and people who take them very often don't want to be on them because the side effects are difficult to endure. But we didn't even have that, pre-industrial period. So people would be sent to asylums where they would often languish. Leprosy was one of the diseases that commonly afflicted the population. It was terrifying. Leprosy is common in warmer, wet climates. So places like Louisiana have endemic leprosy, still do. One of the modes of transmission is through armadillos. You guys ever seen an armadillo like outside of a zoo? Yeah, traveled in the South. Yeah, you see them on the road. They're roadkill all the time because they move slow. They're really cute, but you don't want to handle one because they tend to carry leprosy, which is also known as Hansen's disease. So they carry a bacteria that causes leprosy. Leprosy, the reason that armadillos carry leprosy so effectively is their body temperature is very low. And so leprosy, the bacteria that causes leprosy can only exist in a relatively narrow range of temperature. And it likes cooler biological subjects. And so if you were to handle an armadillo or work in the dirt where an armadillo had been, and by the way, what they'd like to do is come and dig up your garden. I lived in Louisiana for a few years, so they come and they dig up your garden and they like eat your flowers and stuff. So if you get leprosy, the bacteria affects the coldest parts of your body, your fingers, your toes, your nose, your ears, right? And what it does is it causes your nerves to die. And so it's the germ itself does not like eat your face. What happens instead, or eats your fingers, what happens instead is you lose sensitivity in your fingers, and then you bang them on something, get a cut on something, then you get an infection, and then your fingers start to basically rot off like this poor person you can see. So a lepra, advanced stages of Hansen's disease, people will lose their extremities first, ears, nose, eyelids, so forth, the cold parts of your body. There was no cure for leprosy, right, throughout history until relatively recently. We can cure it now, but we didn't understand what bacteria. We thought that maggots emerged out of nowhere on meat, right? We didn't have any understanding in pre-industrial world, not just in America but anywhere, about germ theory, and we didn't understand that there this process was happening to these poor people. So there was no treatment. What we did know was it's contagious and it's super scary. And if you've read the Bible or the Old Testament, New Testament, the Torah, if you will, there's lots of discussion about lepers, and it's not clear that they were actually talking about Hansen's disease, but some sort of contagious disease was often referred to in the Bible. And so how are these people treated? Well, they were expelled from community, right? They were shunned aside. If they were lucky, maybe they were put in a pest house, but more likely they were ostracized. Hawaii had terrible leprosy. So I lived in Hawaii for a few years when I was in the Army, learned about this place called Molokai. So Hawaii is a chain of islands, right? The main island is Oahu. The big island is actually called Hawaii. But the island that when you think of, I'm going to go to Hawaii and I'm going to go, when you watch the surfing and stuff, it's typically Oahu is what you're seeing. So Oahu is the main island. Molokai, you can see it from the main island. It's not that far away. And it is still one of the less populated islands. I never got there myself during the time I was there. But what would happen, so Hawaii is one of those lovely places where the temperature is always just right around here, which Hansen's disease loves. And so leprosy took hold in Hawaii, and lots of people got it. And it is contagious. And so the solution was public health department equivalent, would come around looking for people with leprosy. If they got a report, if your neighbor ratted on you and said, looks like, so-and-so has got leprosy, the public health people would come, check you out, take you and put you on a ship and take you to Molokai, to Kalapapa, where you would be quarantined, right? The thing is that there were no or very few government representatives on Kalapapa. You can see these big cliffs. So this is like a beach. There's these big cliffs. So you could only get to Kalapapa by boat, right? So they would say there were other populations on the island, but they were over the cliffs. So you really just couldn't get to them easily. So they would sail up, at some point, this became really tragic. They would sail up, get close to the island, and then just basically kick you overboard. And you'd have to, because the sailors didn't want to get leprosy. It was bad enough that you were already on the boat. They would just get you off. And this was sort of a Lord of the Flies kind of situation where, they'd dump over some supplies, right? But the people, were ill-fed, ill-housed, and it was a pretty ugly life. And it was a life sentence. You were not coming back from this. I mean, leprosy was a terminal disease. It was a slow, painful, awful terminal disease, but it was a terminal disease, and you weren't coming home. So miserable place. So this was the solution that we had in pre-industrial world, not just America, right? But the world. This is how we dealt with in pre-industrial times. This is how we dealt with contagious disease like leprosy. Now, not all, right? So to be fair, right? There were people who did care, who did do what they could to help the people who were ill, and so this often fell to people who felt a calling to religious orders. And so this gentleman, Father Damien, was a priest on Oahu, and the bishop had heard of the terrible conditions of the people on Molokai and Kalapapa. And so Damien volunteered to go serve the people of Molokai. And he did for a number of years. He arrived in 1873 and he ultimately died of the disease 16 years later. But he had a profound effect on providing comfort and order to what had been something of a Lord of the Flies kind of situation. So, you know, one person can make a difference. It's a beautiful thing. And he was sainted. So if you're Catholic, he's a saint. If you're not Catholic, he's still a saint, I think. You know, to know you're going someplace where you will likely die to serve other people is still a pretty amazing thing that I think when we think about healthcare, you know, most people go into our field, into this field to serve. So that was, and there are stories like that all over the world about things like leper colonies, right? So then we head into the post-industrial era. So now we talked about the industrial, you know, the Industrial Revolution. And so these periods that I'm talking about overlap, and the technology is diffusing at different rates in different places. So the years are going to overlap some. But in the early 1800s or so, we're beginning to see the effects of the steam engine. You know, we've had 50 or 60 years. We're beginning to see the effects of expanded trade and production, and our wealth is beginning to increase. And I want to, you know, I'm going to keep coming back to that. Wealth and health, they're tied together. We may not like to talk about it like that, but wealth and health, both at the individual and the population level, are tied together. So the 1800s is the post-industrial era, is also a period of scientific revolution, right? We've got the scientific revolution is driving the industrial revolution. The scientific revolution is now beginning to actually have medicine that works, right? So we're finally breaking away from the 2,500-year-old theory of the humors. We're going to bleed you if you're, you know, if we're going to bleed you if you've got a fever kind of mentality, right? Other things that are important to bear in mind in the post-industrial era is, as we become wealthier, people begin to leave the farms, right? Leave the rural life and come into the cities in droves. So the period of the late 1800s and through World War II is a real inversion of where the populations lived. Pre-Civil War, 90% of the population in the United States lived in rural areas. By the time World War II ended, that had reversed itself. So that 90%, 75 to 90, I mean, the progression has continued. Today, we're about 90% urban and about 10% rural. Back in the pre-industrial period, something like 96% of the population farmed, right? That's where you work. More than 95, 96% of the population were farmers. And then the other 4% were doing all the other stuff, right? We were truly deeply poor, right? This was not because we were really like back to the land and we loved, you know, the soil in our fingers. It was because our food production was so inefficient that everybody had to farm in order to survive. The Industrial Revolution changed all that with transportation, with better fertilization, with better tools, more food, better health, right? Because if your body is existing, you nutrition people know this, if you are malnourished, you are more likely to get contagious diseases. If you are malnourished, the flu will kill you. A cold might kill you, right? And most people were malnourished, pre-industrial. Post-industrial, food production went up dramatically, right? The ability to move food around became much more effective. So rising wealth and standard of living had direct effects on lifespans, right, and mortality. We also saw in that period, as wealth rose, we saw the emergence of state capacity, right, the ability of governments to actually do stuff. And we also saw the beginnings in the United States of the emergence of professionalization. So professionalization is beginning to happen in the United States, and we see the emergence of the American Medical Association and the process of professional licensing. So prior to this, and through most of the 1800s, you could still hang out a shingle and just call yourself a doctor. And it took a long time, and it took the efforts of the American Medical Association to lobby state governments to take on the responsibility of licensing. What did this do? There was a huge competition among different kinds of providers to get themselves licensed and their competition disbarred from practicing medicine. So there were a lot of wealthy men who were getting their MDs, getting their college educations and so forth, who turned around and said, all these women who call themselves midwives and stuff, they're uneducated. They're just, backstreet, rural people, basically witch doctors. They aren't educated like us. They should not be allowed to practice medicine, whereas that was once upon a time thing. The American Medical Association tried to do away with osteopaths. How many of you guys see a DO as a doctor? Anybody? Okay. Probably more of you do, and you don't even know it. So a DO is another kind of physician. They go through their kind of historical origins are more holistic than MDs, medical doctors of osteopathy. So MDs are referred to as allopaths, allopathic medicine, versus osteopathic medicine. Osteopathic medicine, okay. Just had to realize, wasn't sure if I was recording. I need to check. Osteopathic medicine is a more holistic form of medicine. Historically, they used to, physical therapy kind of grows out of the osteopathic side. So they would do a lot, as does chiropractors. So if you see a chiropractor, that's kind of an osteopathic kind of medicine, where they do manipulation of the spine and a number of other things. And they just tend to have philosophically a more holistic perspective, whereas allopathic medicine is much more the tradition of the college trained medicine. And there's still some stigma today between MDs and DOs. MDs tend to look down on DOs. Not all of them do. I mean, today, in fact, there's almost no difference in the training that they get. Osteopathic doctors get some training in manipulation that MDs typically don't. They tend to be a little more open in their training, not necessarily in their practice, but in their training, they tend to be a little more open to complementary medicine, which we'll talk about later. But things like, they would be more open. A DO philosophically would be more open to exploring things like dry needling, acupuncture, right? Also known as dry needling, and things like that. So there was the American Medical Association. Yes, they pushed for standards for their own practitioners, but they also pushed to push everybody else off the stage, right? And why would they do that? Well, medicine actually started to work. And when medicine actually started to work, people were actually willing to pay for it, right? So it became profitable. And so once there was money to be had, right, it became valuable to have a license and restrict who could practice and who couldn't. And so that's always the secret piece of what's going on with professional licensing is I want to restrict the supply of who can do what I do so that I can charge higher prices. So there's, yes, they did a lot of good to standardize training to improve the quality. Licensing is useful in the sense that if you go to someone who has a license for a particular type of skill, you know that they've at least passed some sort of training to get there. Now, here's a funny thing. How long does it, are any of you EMTs, just out of curiosity? It's a common thing. Great. How long was your training for EMT basic? Okay. Really, a whole summer. Okay. So, all right. That's more than I think is required. Did you do like a apprenticeship kind of on top of it, or just the training? Were you doing it part-time? Like you weren't going like you were doing a couple hours a night or something like that? Or you like full-time in school? Okay. So the training in New Hampshire, the training to become an EMT is, if you go full-time to the schooling, it's like a month. It's like a few weeks schooling, and you can become an EMT. So you're driving around on you're gonna be driving around in an ambulance, saving people's lives. So good for you. Right. How long does it take to be a barber in New Hampshire? To get licensed as a barber in New Hampshire? So I think it's 6 months. So it's like, 5 times as long as it takes to become an EMT. Because you never know, being a barber and, get the scissors and you never, cut somebody and kill them, as opposed to our friend who is driving around on on an ambulance doing life-saving, intentionally doing life-saving things, right? We have this licensing process to become a barber, and then to become a cosmetologist is even longer. I don't know the number on that, but to become a cosmetologist is even longer. So we have this whole world of occupational licensing, and depending on the state you're in, different states require licenses for. Everybody requires a license for physicians, right? Not almost every state requires licensing to be a barber. I mean, if in today's world, back in the day, of course, you would have been doing amputations and stuff like that. So I would have liked to, had some training, for doing that. But today's barbers don't do a lot of amputations anymore. So pretty safe thing, yet we require these. There are a variety, some states require, if you're going to be an interior decorator, you have to get a license. Not a lot of risk involved in interior decorating, other than you're going to make somebody's house look ugly, right? And yet there are states that require that you go through a licensing process that usually involves an apprenticeship of some period of time. The purpose primarily is to restrict competition. So this is something to keep in mind when you think about licensing, right? There's a balance here between public safety and economic interests of the individuals in the marketplace. And so what we saw was the MDs, the American Medical Association was very effective at cleaning up healthcare in the sense of getting out a lot of the folks who are snake oil salesmen, which is a good thing. So that's something to keep in mind, before we get all weepy about the AMA. Some advances that were happening that made radical differences in the outcomes of medicine and the effectiveness of medicine included things like aseptic technique, which is basically keeping the area you're working in clean, right? Washing your hands before you touch a patient so that you're not bringing germs into touching a patient. So this gentleman, Dr. Ignaz Semmelweis, is a German physician, trained at all the finest German medical schools in the latest versions of Hippocratic medicine, was working in a maternity hospital. And the maternity hospital had two sides to it. There was the rich person's side, and there was the charitable side. The rich person's side was run by physicians. And so if you were a wealthy woman and you were going to have a baby and you wanted to have it in a professional environment, you would go to see Dr. Semmelweis and his colleagues. If you were poor, you would go to the other side of the hospital, which was run by midwives, so nurse midwives. So they were still allowed to practice. So the poor people saw the midwives, the rich people saw the doctors. And Semmelweis noticed that the mortality, because childbirth through the kind of early 20th century was a very dangerous thing, right? Some women successfully gave birth to 14 or 15 kids. Other women died in childbirth, on their first child. It was very dangerous to have children. Common to have women die in childbirth. But what Semmelweis noticed was the mortality rates on the rich side were dramatically higher than the mortality rates on the poor side, which made no sense because they had gone to all the finest training, right? These were doctors after all, German tradition. And so he started to think about what it was. And a lot of them were dying of this thing called puerperal fever. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but puerperal fever, which is childbed fever. So rich women would have their baby, deliver it. The doctor would come in, deliver the baby. And then the women would come down with childbed fever and they would die. So it wasn't the actual childbirth that was killing them. It was the fever that they would get after childbirth. Now, today we know fever is the result of infection, right? But bear in mind, Semmelweis did not know that germs existed. Semmelweis had been trained in the theory of spontaneous generation. So he didn't understand that, but he knew something was wrong. And being a good scientist, he started keeping track of when and how women were dying. And what he realized was that what he and his colleagues were often doing was they would deliver a patient, deliver a baby. They would, if someone died of puerperal fever, the body would be taken out to the morgue, and they would do an autopsy on the body to, review what the cause of death was. And then they'd get called from the morgue to come deliver another baby. So they would take their hands out of the deceased body and go deliver another baby. And did you notice I did this, I didn't do, right? I didn't wash my hands. So what they were doing was they were putting their hands inside of a woman who had died of puerperal fever, not washing their hands, and then going and putting their hands inside of a woman delivering a baby, deliver the baby, then the woman would come down with puerperal fever. Now, all of us are like, germs, you dumb, individuals. But unfortunately, that was still about 20 years away, right? But what he kind of said was, well, it seems like the physicians who wash their hands don't then give their patients then don't get puerperal fever. So he started experimenting with hand washing and came up with a technique for, I think he used lye, some other nasty chemicals, but oh, by the way, his patients didn't die. So Semmelweis's patients stopped dying of puerperal fever. His colleagues were still giving puerperal fever to their patients and they were dying. And so he said, hey guys, let's wash our hands. Let's try that. And they were all like, you're a jerk. Knock that off. Who do you think you are telling us what to do? We went to the finest medical schools and they didn't say we had to wash our hands. And they tried to run Semmelweis out of town. He was like, no, you need to wash, good German, you need to wash your hands, right? And they're like, no, that's, science says we don't need to do that. Follow the science, Semmelweis. Science says we don't need to do that. Does that sound familiar, by the way? Science says we don't need to do that. Oh yeah, well, Semmelweis was right. They were wrong. but it took a long time because he was violating a long tradition, right, of doctors doing whatever the heck they felt like doing and not following kind of a quality improvement process. We'll talk more about that later, but Semmelweis he didn't really know why washing the hands worked. He didn't have the science behind it. He just knew if you wash your hands, you will not kill your patients. And the doctors who were his colleagues didn't care enough about their patients to follow that simple advice because their egos were tied up in, doing what they'd been trained to do because they were so smart and they'd gone to all the best universities. Ma'am. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you look like you're really right. You're looking like you're a real doctor, So they didn't like that. So they tried to run Semmelweis out of town. They really gave him a hard time. And he just kept coming back and saying, you need to wash your hands, you need to wash your hands. And eventually, it was borne out. And it was borne out because germ theory comes about in the 1860s, discoveries by Louis Pasteur, who found, bread gets moldy. What causes bread to get moldy? Well, bacteria. Not bacteria. Mold is not bacteria. Mold is actually will kill bacteria, but what he found was penicillin comes from mold. And what he found was mold actually kills bacteria. So this is an interesting thing. Any of you brewed your own beer? No, not yet. You're too young. That's the kind of thing you do when you get to be middle-aged. You're like, I want to recapture my youth. I'm going to brew my own beer. Sort of like I'm old, but I'm also young. Or baked bread. I made sour bread. Anybody made sourdough? That was like the thing to do in March of 2020. Everybody started learning how to make sourdough. So the process of sourdough is you take a bowl of flour and water and you stick it out open to the air, right? And over about 48 hours or so, you'll suddenly see that the flour water mixture starts to bubble. What's happened is there are yeasts, natural yeasts in the air that float around all the time. You're breathing them all the time. And they land in places and they love a bowl of wet flour. And so they land on it and they start eating the bread and making, and that stink, which tastes really good. Sourdough tastes really good, but that sourness is a result of them chewing through the bacteria and pooping out alcohol, right? And the reason they do that, the adaptive function of yeast eating grains and pooping out alcohol, right, is because bacteria can't survive in alcohol. And so the yeast are basically like pooping out alcohol all over what they're eating to keep the bacteria from coming in and landing. So the yeast are killing the bacteria by making alcohol. And that's why, so the same process happens in beer and wine is yeast. You use yeast to ferment beer and wine. And that is why I made a kind of passing joke about it, but it was safer to drink beer back in 18th century London than it was to drink the water. Same like the advice in, I used to live in El Paso and the advice was don't drink the water, drink the beer, which is actually made a lot of sense. So if you go you go back in the day before the drug gangs took over Juarez, we would walk across the bridge. You'd drive down to downtown El Paso, you'd walk across the bridge into Juarez and you could go shopping, you pick up a taxi and go shopping or go to I had a professor, I was taking some classes at the time and one of my professors said, El Paso is fine. It's kind of a mid-sized city. It's never going to be anything amazing. You can get a lot of good food here. You can get some nice hotels. But if you want a 5-star experience, you have to go to Juarez, right? Because Juarez was like 3 times the size of El Paso. Juarez is the city the sister city of El Paso in Mexico. But if you're going to a cafe in Juarez, Americans did not do well with the water. So the advice was drink the cerveza, not the aqua. So Pasteur discovers germ theory, basically, and penicillin, right? And he discovers that molds will kill bacteria. So if you eat cheeses, certain cheeses have like a rind on them, a white rind on them, a brie, for example, that's mold, right? That's mold on the outside. And so mold does the same thing as yeast does. It creates a poison to bacteria. So the bacteria can't infect the cheese because the mold has basically pooped all over the cheese and, and made it so that the bacteria can't survive. So his discoveries were the basis of penicillin back in, so he's discovering this in the 1860s, but we don't develop penicillin until the 1920s, right? But we're starting to understand, okay, oh, that's what was happening with the women in the hospital. Was we were taking germs from one patient and sticking them into a healthy patient, and that's why they were dying. So the X-ray, discovered in 1895 by Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen. I can't say my German. That's a picture of his wife's hand. It's one of the first X-rays ever taken. Röntgen. We'd say in American, in English, I think we say Röntgens, and we measure radiation that way. So some other things that were happening. Mass Gen, first surgery conducted under anesthesia, 1846. So from all time immemorial up until 1846, you were having your limbs hacked off without any, without any anesthesia. So if you went to war, or if you got an infection that couldn't be treated, you had your limb hacked off without any anesthesia. Now, how many of you guys have had an infection where you had to get antibiotics? I mean, I had one really bad one when I was a little kid. I mean, I had like an open sore on my calf. At the time, we were so poor we didn't have health care. We didn't have health insurance, and we were going to a nurse-run clinic in Worcester, and just weren't able to really get very good care. So I had this open sore on my leg when I was a little kid. I remember, and I always think about this when I talk about this is, I did eventually get antibiotics that eventually did heal that. It took a long time. Mostly because we were poor and it was hard to get the healthcare. But had I been alive in 1870 instead of 1970, they probably would have taken my leg off, because we didn't have antibiotics in 1870. And if you got a really bad infection, it would kill you. And so better to take your leg than to let you die from the infection. So they would have taken my leg without anesthesia as a little kid. Right? So 1846, first surgery with anesthesia done at Mass Gen. They still have the ether dome is what they call it, which is a surgical suite where they did the first anesthesia. And so they do like residency graduations in the ether dome. It's a famous place. Aseptic Technique, that was the Semmelweis thing. So they're beginning to figure that out, that we should wash our hands, active sterilization techniques. So, if you were a battlefield casualty and you needed surgery, you would have gotten that battlefield surgery. The surgeon would have cut your leg off, then gone to the next person and cut their leg off, and they wouldn't have cleaned the saw in between, most likely, right? So we didn't understand that, like all this stuff about germ theory, like why am I, it's just blood, just going to get more blood on it. It's not like, why would I need to worry about that? X-ray imaging, right? Penicillin. So these are all things that made healthcare actually work, right? That's my point. So we look back on Kalaupapa, right? The Hawaii, and the isolation there, and it sounds horrible. And you know what? It was horrible. but we didn't have any ability to do anything else. That was the best we could do, right? Putting people in isolation to die miserable deaths on their own was the best we could do. So you have to have some empathy for our ancestors who lived in periods prior to these sorts of things. And we're going to talk more about some of the amazing miracles that have happened in healthcare. But before we get there, I want to kind of just hold that in mind, that it wasn't like, so first of all, it wasn't like they were doing the great stuff in Europe and we were all just a bunch of idiots over here. It was nobody knew what they were doing. Nobody had the technology to do the thing, right? We had people who had high status because they had gone to fancy schools, but they didn't know any more than the backwoods person who was doing the best they could, right? So these incredible discoveries are happening as a result of the scientific revolution, as a result of the Enlightenment, as a result of us changing the way we thought about science, right? And it takes a long time for them to diffuse through the system because, like Semmelweis's colleagues, people were wedded to the things they had learned. They don't like change, right? People don't like change. It requires them to put forth effort. So so we've talked about physicians and kind of, physician training. Well, as technology gets better, we start to teach our physicians to use the technology. They start using it. Why do they start using it? Well, because if you treat people and they actually get better, they will pay you more money. They will give you more respect. So physicians became, right? It became valuable to be a physician. People weren't terrified of you because back in the day, people were pretty scared of physicians because they did scary things to you, right? On the other hand, hospitals were, primarily those almshouses and pest houses where you were either poor or you were contagious and likely to die. Either one, nobody wanted to go to a hospital, right? There was no idea that going to a hospital would be like, if you get sick, oh, take me to the hospital. No, it's like, no, don't take me to the hospital, right? Right. So it wasn't like that. But as technology emerges and becomes actually effective, it gets really expensive really fast. Okay. And that doesn't stop, right? So that's, it gets expensive and it just keeps on going, getting more expensive. And so it makes sense to centralize technologies like X-ray, laboratory, surgical suites with ether, right? And so where do we centralize those things? We centralize them in hospitals. And so hospitals begin to evolve from this almshouse, pest house idea into technological workshops for doctors. So there's a bunch of different theories around hospitals. That's really one of my favorites, and not everybody agrees. So I'll tell you that up front. Not everybody agrees, but there's a famous paper, that kind of says, it's an economic paper, and it says the most effective way to think about a hospital and its motivations and its incentives is to think about it as a doctor's workshop. So if any of you are artists that, and you throw clay, so you make pots or something like that, it's expensive to own your own wheel. It's expensive to own your own kiln, right? And when you fire a kiln, it's expensive to run it, right? It takes a lot of electricity or a lot of power, whether it's electricity or propane or whatever. And they tend to be pretty big. So you put a lot of pieces in it all at once. So if you, instead of having your own kiln, you maybe rent one from, say, the UNH art shop, you go to the UNH art shop. Now you can get 20 artists sharing it. You can each do a pot, put them all in the kiln together, fire it once, and you pay for 1/20 of the cost, right? And then you can use the wheel, but you think about most things that you own. Think about your car, like those of you that own a car. How many hours in a week? Like there's 168 hours in a week. How many hours in the week do you actually drive your car? Now, if you're driving a lot, it's probably like 7 or 8 hours, 10 hours maybe, right? And the other 158 hours, it just sits there and does nothing. It just sits and waits for you to come drive it. So Uber actually makes a whole lot more sense, right? Especially but only if you live in a city, right, where lots of people can share the one car. Right, then it makes a lot of sense. And it doesn't make sense to own, if you live in downtown Boston, it doesn't really make sense to own a car because you're gonna have to pay for the car, pay for, pay more for a space in downtown Boston than probably your apartment up here costs, right? And then to have it sit for 158 hours a week. Doesn't make a lot of sense. But Uber, now you kind of have a shared asset, right? We call that the, all these, gig stuff we refer to as the sharing economy, right? Airbnb, you own a nice vacation house, up in North Conway, and you could go skiing, but you only have time to go skiing like twice or 3 times a year. Maybe you go up a couple times in the summer. Otherwise, that house sits vacant. Well, let's turn it over to Airbnb and let them rent it out, and we can make a profit in the process, right? So think of a hospital that way. Like individual doctors could build their own laboratory, build their own radiology, buy their own X-ray machines. They could build their own surgical suites. But most of the time it would just sit empty. So it doesn't make sense. So that's why hospitals evolved to have these, to be technological centers, right? That are focal points for technology. And oh, by the way, then the hospital can employ the radiology technicians, and you don't have to as a physician, right? They can train nurses to be your OR nurses. And so you just show up, wash your hands, right? Wash your hands, put your gloves on, go in and do your surgery. The nurses, the technology is all there. So this is a thing that, for me as coming out of the military medical system, I never really thought about it because our doctors were in the Army just like I was, right? And we all answered to the same hospital commander, and the hospital commander could boss me around and they could boss the doctors around. And it was kind of it was kind of an eye-opening thing because that was my exposure to healthcare as a young person. Well, as a young professional, I should say. And then when I started meeting people who worked outside the hospital, what I learned outside the military, what I learned was the hospital CEO does not employ the doctors in most cases. Doctors are independent practitioners who come in to the hospital, perform procedures, and then leave. And they're a separate business. And so if you ever go to a hospital, or if you ever get a surgery, or if you go to the ED, you're going to get 2 bills. You're going to get one bill from the hospital, right? And then you're going to get another bill from the physician. Have you ever seen that? Gotten multiple bills for the same thing? Yeah, some of you are nodding. Okay. Some of you probably have gotten those bills, but your parents paid them, so they didn't tell you, right? But it is common to have a bill from the facility, and then a bill, and then what we call a professional fee, a fee from your physician. And if you have surgery, you might get 2 or 3 bills. Right, or 3 or 4 bills. You might get one from the hospital, one from the surgeon, one from the anesthesiologist, who's also a doctor and not employed by the hospital, and maybe another one from the radiologist who did an X-ray on your foot before you went into surgery, who didn't even do the X-ray, just read the X-ray. It was a X-ray technician employed by the hospital who did the X-ray, but a radiologist read the X-ray and sends you a separate charge. So one of the things I learned that has stuck with me is talking to a guy who had gotten out of the military and gone to work in the civilian sector. He's like, and he was a chief financial officer like I was, but in the civilian sector. He had been a chief financial officer in the Army. And he said, the thing that we don't understand in the military is these guys, that the patient is not the client of the hospital. The patient is not the client of the hospital, right? Or not the customer of the hospital. The doctor is the customer of the hospital. And the hospitals all bend to the will of the doctors. Why is that? You don't go to a hospital to get knee surgery and just show up and say, I want this hospital. Typically, what you do is you will see a orthopedic surgeon. You may get referred to an orthopedic surgeon from a hospital, right? The physician decides where he or she is going to do the procedure, not the hospital. The physician, so you go to see a doctor, I fell down, I twisted my ankle. Oh, well, you need surgery. Okay, I'm going to, you see your family medicine doctor, he refers you to, or she refers you to an orthopedist. the orthopedist looks at you and she says, you're going to need surgery. I'm going to need to put in some, screws into your ankle. I want you to go to Wentworth Douglas. We'll do the procedure at Wentworth Douglas, or I'm going to take you to, I'm going to do the procedure at Portsmouth Regional, or I'm going to do the procedure at Exeter. It's the doctor that tells you where he or she is going to do the procedure. And so hospitals cater to doctors to try to convince them to bring their patients to their hospital. Now they want you to feel good and like it, but at the end of the day, it's the doctors who decide where the patients go. And so ultimately the hospitals care more about what the physicians think than what you think, because the doctor is their primary customer. So it's an interesting thing. So then you think about it that way also from a doctor's workshop perspective. Legally, you don't get to choose the hospital you go to. And so I just thought this was kind of fun example, right? Here's on the left, we have our pre-industrial hospital, right? Surgical suite. And on the right, we have our modern surgical suite, right? Aseptic technique, everybody's gowned up, gloves, right? The environment is sterile. We have overpressure to force air out, right? As opposed to this, there's like open air. People are watching from the stands, like no masks, no masks, right? Germs blowing all around. And this is that idea of 0 to 1 that I talked about earlier, Peter Thiel, right? 0 to 1, like there was nothing and then there was something, right? So the picture on the left is horrifying, but better than nothing, right? So that's something. And then from there, we evolve to something really amazing, really miraculous, right? The picture on the right. So the next kind of stage, so we had pre-industrial, post-industrial, and then we have kind of this process of medicine becoming institutionalized. It begins in the post-industrial period, right? I've talked about, I think, most of this already. But the AMA begins to force the formalization of medicine. There are a number of reports. Your book does a good job of walking through all the kind of studies and reports that came out that forced kind of the elimination of old school or not schooled physicians out of the market, right? But they also squeezed out people like naturopaths, right? Which is another kind of physician. There's I did an interview. If you go far enough back in the podcast list, you'll find I did an interview with a naturopath who's up in Portsmouth, and she does a lot of homeopathy, holistic medicine. It's interesting. I don't think I would use one of those, but she goes through. She went, her medical training was very similar to the medical training you would see an MD or a DO go through. They have even more holistic kind of approach to medicine. So they focus a lot on diet. This one woman this one naturopath I talked about, how she had all these, I think it was rashes. She said she had these terrible rashes and they gave her all these kinds of medicines and nothing would stop the rashes. And then she started looking into nutrition. She changed the way she ate and some other things, and the rashes went away. And so that inspired her that she wanted to do the same thing. So she focuses, if you go to see a naturopath, they focus on, on this kind of holistic approach to medicine. Well, when she hung out her shingle in New Hampshire, she was technically practicing without a license because they weren't licensing naturopaths to practice medicine in New Hampshire. And so she just kind of said, her and I think her husband, they're both naturopaths. And it's been a while since I did the interview, decided we're going to just do it. And they did. And then they were able to force through eventually licensing of naturopaths as physicians in New Hampshire. But that's an example. So again, bear in mind, these organizations like the AMA, they do a lot of good on kind of out of a sake for doing good. they also are very much self-interested. So whenever you hear occupational licensing, whether it's medical licensing or some other, or electrician's license or whatever, bear in mind that there are two components to that. There are two sides to occupational licensing. One is that we're ensuring a certain minimum level of quality. The other is we're keeping other people from practicing. Right? So we have, other institutions emerge, like the Association of Medical Colleges, American Medical Colleges. And so these things, we see kind of this institutionalization and professionalization in medicine. The other thing we start to see is specialization. So it was once upon a time that your family medicine doc would do surgery on you and all kinds of stuff. I remember my grandmother talking about her family medicine doc, in the 60s, taking her to the OR and taking out a large, grapefruit-sized cyst out of her. Well, today a family medicine doc would never do that. First of all, a family medicine doc wouldn't try to do that. They would turn you over to a general surgeon, and a hospital wouldn't let a family medicine doc do that because they're not trained. Yes, they could do it maybe in an emergency, but they're not trained at the level that general surgeons are to do that sort of surgery. And so what we saw through, over time was this evolution, and we continue to see it today, of specialization away from family medicine, right? Broad spectrum, like a physician treating everybody at every stage of life, into progressively more and more specialized fields. And we'll talk more about this later. Mental health, a series of things have come about through mental health. So we started to recognize, we've talked about this a little bit before, we really didn't recognize mental health. Mental health is challenging, right? Where is, so what is alcoholism? Is alcoholism a disease, or is alcoholism a character flaw? Well, historically, it was a character flaw, only a character flaw, right? But then we started to, and so then society, going back to our models of illness and disease, right? Society did not recognize it as a disease. It was a character flaw. We have kind of since then said, okay, it is a disease. We recognize it as a disease. But if you talk to psychiatrists and other practitioners, they will tell you it's a little bit of both, right? Addiction is a little bit of both. People can make a decision to fix their addiction. But once you become an addict, it's a very, very hard life, right? Because you have to kind of make that decision every day that you're not going to fall back into addiction. So it's a disease. It's also a character issue. And that's a point of contention, right? So I will say that's kind of my opinion. And I will say that I have backing on that, but not everybody agrees, right? Some people say it's a pure disease. Some people say it's a pure character flaw. I say it's a little bit of both. But that's me speaking based on my reading. Like I said, we didn't have treatment for mental illness. And so people were just mad, right? They were just mad, and we'd send them to asylums, and it was horrible. And we had homes for people with cognitive developmental disabilities, so people with Down syndrome and stuff. People weren't able to treat that, or had difficulty taking care of it, so they would send them to schools. There were some of these schools in Massachusetts up through the 90s that were horror shows, like stuff out of movies of children being children with developmental disabilities being treated horribly. And by then, of course, I would say we knew better. So it's a shame that they managed to hang on as long as they did. And there's some stories about that. But it wasn't until the 60s that we had drugs that could actually do some stuff like work on psychosis, which, break in reality. They didn't work terribly well, but they work some. And so what that allowed you to do was, if you had schizophrenia, for example, they would just lock you away in an asylum, right, forever. Well, if we can give you medication to treat your psychosis, you could start to come out into the community and have get your care in the community. And so there was this process of deinstitutionalization that has kind of probably swung too far. Too many people have been deinstitutionalized, and probably we need more institutionalization. And I've got a short paper I'm going to have that's in the additional reading for you to read about that. Institutionalization is very appropriate for early stage treatment of addiction, for example. Often necessary, sometimes involuntary institutionalization. But we had otherwise reasonably, not mentally ill people who are being trapped in mental asylums, confined to mental asylums forever, right? That could be treated on an outpatient basis. And so we have this Community Health Center Act. So if you're interested in community mental health centers, this is a low income. These are mental health centers set up to serve the low income. There's one Seacoast Community Mental Health Center. So Jay Kuchar is a grad of HMP, and she's the CEO there. And I've done an interview with her. So if you're interested in learning more about community mental health centers, you can do your podcast review on her. Olmsted versus LC, famous case that required states to fund community-based mental health treatment. So the states have historically not, people don't want to pay for mental health for other people, right? Because we still revert back to it being a character flaw, not a disease. And so Olmsted required that states fund community-based mental health. And so people like Jay Kuchar and her colleagues are always working with the state to try to get more care at more appropriate settings for the people they care about. All right, I got to speed up a little bit. So what was happening that was causing these changes to happen? Couple of things, and we'll keep coming back to these. Technology, right? The emergence of the X-ray, the emergence of antibiotics, social. The technology, the medical care actually starts to work, right? And so we become more confident in it. Economic, right? When you're poor, you can't afford anything. And so as a society, we became wealthier and able to purchase this expensive care. We saw the rise of private health insurance. So back in the day, nobody had health insurance. You paid, first of all, healthcare was cheap because it didn't work very well anyway. So your doctor came, bled you, you gave him a chicken, and that was the end of it. But as healthcare started to actually work, we needed to have a way to pay for it. And so modern health insurance really kind of traces its life back to 1929 to Baylor Hospital, once upon a time associated with Baylor University, not anymore. And this was basically 1929, we're in the middle of the Great Depression. People didn't have any money, and hospitals, of course, and so people were not getting care. When you're poor, you don't get medical care. This is a problem that the ACA was trying to address. And so what Baylor cleverly did was they went to the teachers in the community and said, hey, for 50 cents a week, we will insure you such that if you need to be hospitalized for 50 cents a week, you will get up to 3 weeks of inpatient stay in our hospital. And so they sold this to the local teachers as a way to spread the cost of healthcare. So now we were starting to, chances are you weren't going to need to be hospitalized, but you know what, if you do, it's only 50 cents a week. We pool all that money together and Baylor gets to keep it. And if you do get sick, you get to go to see a physician, to the hospital. Physician costs were still separate because remember, 2 different bills. The hospital is just the doctor's workshop. When the doctor would come see you in the hospital, that was a separate bill. So the initial plan was hospital insurance only. It was for the hospital component of your stay. This evolves into Blue Cross, which some of you may have, Blue Cross insurance. And then later, Blue Shield was to cover physician services. So, because remember, Blue Cross would have only covered the hospital stay. Then you have Blue Shield covers the physician component of your stay. So now you're getting the two bills, one from the hospital, one from the physician. Blue Cross pays the hospital bill, Blue Shield pays the physician bill. They're combined now, but that was the origins. So World War II, today, most of us get our health insurance through our employer. That was not the case once upon a time. What was the case instead was you'd pay privately for it. Well, during the war, they put a freeze on wages. Employers needed more labor, desperately needed labor. Labor was being bid up. The price of labor was being bid up. People were like, well, I'll go here, I'll go there. The federal government put a cap on wages. And so one way to compete, they couldn't pay more. So employers couldn't pay you more. They had to start offering you amenities like health insurance. And so that's how health insurance became an employment benefit, an employment-based benefit. So there was an 1848 Supreme Court decision that said that this is a thing that the unions could bargain for, and so it's become a big thing. And there was this kind of, so employers weren't sure, could we, because employers can deduct the cost of so if you work for a company, they treat your pay as an expense and it reduces their taxable profits. But they didn't know, well, if we pay for their insurance, is that an expense too? And so somebody wrote to the IRS, and some little old lady in tennis shoes wrote back and said, yep, you can count that as an expense and it reduces your taxable burden. So this is a great thing for companies because it allowed them to, if they paid for insurance, they didn't have to pay as much taxes. Nobody really knows who the little old lady in tennis shoes, this is a joke, this is the mythical little old lady in tennis shoes that's deep in the bowels of government someplace making all the decisions that affect our lives. So I think nobody knows who this person was that like provided that. It was some like low level person like, yeah, whatever, right? And then it's like shaped modern healthcare, right? And so that is this IRS ruling. Some IRS employee said, yeah, and then it's kind of just stuck. NHI, National Health Insurance Plans, just tend not to take effect in the United States. It's not for lack of trying. Politicians have been trying to get national health insurance passed literally for centuries now, right? In the United States. And what I would tie that back to is a lot of our values that we've talked about in previous classes, like individualism, right? But there's also a lot of politics in healthcare. Physicians have fought tooth and nail against NHI. Hospitals have fought tooth and nail against NHI because what they recognize is if NHI goes through, the government will set prices low and they will make less income. So places like, most of Europe, Canada, physicians make a fraction in Europe of what our physicians make, right? And so our physicians don't, as much as they weep about it in public, they don't actually want it to go through. And the AMA fights all these proposals every time. So if you like it, that's another thing. All right. So Medicare and Medicaid were the result of an effort to try to bring about national health insurance. And, that failed. But what they did was, they said, well, we'll give it to the old. We'll give it to the old people. The old people are adorable. They can't really fend for themselves. We've got to, we'll give it to the old people. So so Medicare was developed to give to the old people, right? And then we said, all right, we will also give it to the worthy poor, right? So Medicaid. So we're going to have a test ability to pay, right? So we test the ability to pay. And you can get it from Medicaid. So, but Medicare, because this is a funny thing in policy, right? And it's commonly seen in policy that if you can give it to a larger population, you're more likely to get it passed. So everybody says everybody hopes to get to be 65 someday. So everybody's like, all right, we'll do that. And we'll make that reasonably generous. But Medicaid, nobody actually hopes to be poor someday. So the Medicaid benefit is relatively stingy, whereas the Medicare benefit is relatively robust. Medicare is two parts. Part A covers hospital expenses. Part B covers the professional costs. I kind of said that already. You can read that later. The HMO Act, so this is a different way of delivering care. It's an integrated mechanism where you integrate together. This is Health Maintenance Organization, HMO. And the idea was, it came out of, again, out of World War II. Kaiser Permanente is probably the biggest HMO in the country. You pay one fee for your health insurance, and they provide services that wrap around you. They're not just interested in, it's not a transactional relationship. They're responsible for your care from soup to nuts. The idea here was that seemed, because by the 70s, everything was becoming very expensive. Healthcare was becoming very expensive, so they thought they'd be able to reduce costs by going through the HMO. Hasn't really taken off. So then we get into this kind of corporate era, which is kind of the present. And the three main features of this are doctors move away from being individual providers into big groups, and then from groups into corporations. Just verify my time. All right, a few minutes. So the corporate era, you know, what we're seeing is a lot of doctors like my father kind of lament, you know, back in the day, we were respected individual practitioners. Nobody questioned us. Well, now that you're, you know, working with the insurance companies and they're paying you for everything, you get a lot of questions. So I'll leave that for you to read. Big things that happened: information revolution, right? Telemedicine, telehealth. These are all incredible things that are happening. Health records that keep track of you over time. Globalization, big effect. Medical tourism is really interesting. You'll read about that. I'm going to kind of skip along here because I'm a little bit behind. The last stage is kind of the era of health reform. So we have pre-industrial, post-industrial, corporatization, right? Where medicine becomes more corporate, to the era of health reform, where we're really trying with the ACA, which we've talked about before, trying to improve the delivery of care and reduce its cost, that iron triangle, right? So the ACA had a number of precursors to it. Massachusetts Health Plan was actually one of them, which is kind of funny because, like, you know, the Republicans really skewered it, but it was developed under Romney. And so we have the Affordable Care Act. There's a number of things that they do that does. There's a bunch of Supreme Court fights. The interesting thing about the ACA is that a couple of things. These are the list of, I think, of the most interesting things. Number one is it requires employers, except the smallest ones, to provide health insurance, whereas that was an option before. Now it's a requirement. It entitled you all to stay on your parents' plans until you turn 26, which is kind of crazy. Like, when do you become an adult? 18, you can vote. 21, you can buy alcohol, but you can stay on your parents' plans until you're 26. I mean, at what point are you expected to become an adult? You know, all right. So the aftermath of the ACA, last slide, aftermath of the ACA is we had about 48 million people uninsured. Post-ACA, we're down to about 28 million. So the thing is, though, that most of that came as a result of changes in Medicaid, the expansions of Medicaid. Most of the people who got health insurance that didn't have it before got it as a result of the expansion of Medicaid. So one thing you could ask is, why didn't we just expand Medicaid instead of doing all this other complicated stuff? And that's an answer that I can't give you because it's complicated, right? All right, that's good. So enjoy the weekend, study hard,